making the thesis relevant in the contemporary time. And really, Prem also did a lot of work in revising, updating, and changing a lot of things to make his that he has conceptualized 20 years back again relevant in present time. So two of our examiners, they also meticulously evaluated the thesis and submitted their report. So as per the university rules, we need to conduct the Viva voice test. So I'm very thankful for both the examiners giving their consent to conduct this thing. So with this brief introduction, I request Prem to take Prem around 35 minutes, 40 minutes, 35 minutes or 40 minutes times, Mike, to presentation of your thesis. Please focus more on your findings and empirical kinds of things, because theoretical other things examiners have already gone. I briefly can touch them, but more focus on your empirical kind of things. Yeah. After that, this will be open for comments from. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, all. It's my pleasure to present my thesis after 20 years. I supposed to complete it in 2002, but now after 2 decades, I'm doing this. And thank all of you for giving time, especially to Professor Krishna. Now I'll share my screen with, and then I'll present case. My topic is environmental movement and emerging development alternatives involving science and technology. Study of Uttarakhand with respect to big dams and forest management. About this presentation, the presentation is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, why and how I have selected this issue. Part 2, about study and chapterization. Part 3, methodology. Part 4, highlight of the chapter and conclusion findings. And part 5, recommendation and suggestions. Important aspect of this study. This research thesis is not merely an academic dissertation with the sole purpose of academic achievement. Instead, it is a research thesis related to my life, society, culture, and economy. When I joined the center to do PhD, I was an activist in Uttarakhand separatist statehood movement, and the whole movement was searching for the answer to these questions. Primarily, this is an attempt to search for the answer to an activist question from an academic perspective. This research is based on my basic knowledge and life experience as a member of the community living in a remote Himalayan village. Immersion is used as a critical research strategy in this study project. Furthermore, the finding and learning of the study will be used in the coming year for policy formulation in Uttarakhand. Objective of this study: to explore and understand the impact of industrialization and modernization on the emergence of Uttarakhand environment movement. Number 2, to investigate UAM from a historical and sociological perspective to understand the relevance of alternative development model and the role of science and technology in policy formulation. Number 3, to identify development alternatives that emerge from the Chipko movement, Tehri Dam movement, and the protest against all-weather road project, that is Char Dham road widening project. Number 4, the objective here is to understand how alternative development model that can address the conflict between industrial development and the ecosystem's health. Number 5, to formulate a theoretical framework in the context of UAM and the relevant question of ecologically sustainable development. General hypotheses I use to give direction to this study are: Uttarakhand environment movement is not necessarily confined to purely environmental and ecological concerns. The growth and experience of UAM are a direct response to the national development strategies in industrialization and modernization project that the application of science and technology. Through the application of science and technology, alternative strategies in development involving S&T factor in the UAM are more likely to exhibit a mix of modern S&T and indigenous knowledge system. UAM does not appear to be influenced by anti-science ideology. UAM is not a derivative and product of Western environment movement. Instead, Uttarakhand's regional, local concern and leaders have primarily influenced its origin, intellectual root, and growth. Gandhi's Sarvodaya philosophy and perspective on development not only provide a critique of development concern in the Uttarakhand region, but a framework for alternative strategies in development. Methodology. Immersion is used as a key research strategy in this study. The research is primarily ethnographic research, science, technology, and development perspective that involve the researcher's complete immersion. A transformative worldview is used as a research paradigm, understanding that an academic inquiry must be integrated with politics and a socio-political change agenda. This study mainly used sociological research methods such as ethnography, case studies, and partially social anthropology. Primary source of data and information are participatory and non-participatory observation, key informant, semi-structured interview, and focus group discussions. Secondary source of data and information are published articles, books, government reports, newspaper and magazines, archival record, movements, pamphlet, report of various committees, and all interviews on various aspects of the case studies are reviewed. Chapterization of this thesis, we have 9 chapters. Chapter 1, Introduction. Chapter 2, Literature Review and Theoretical Perspective. Chapter 3, Methodology. Chapter 4, Global Environmental Movement and Trend in Developing Countries. Chapter 5, Environmental Movement in India. Chapter 6, Forest Management and Rise of Chipko Movement in Uttarakhand. Chapter 7, Hydropower Project in Uttarakhand, Case Study of Tehri Dam. This chapter 7 is divided into 3 parts. Number 1, Philosophical Understanding of Tehri Dam Movement, the background of the Tehri Hydro Development Project and its opposition, contemporary Tehri and other hydro projects in Uttarakhand. Chapter 8, Uttarakhand Environment Movement and Emergence of Alternative. This chapter is further divided into 3 parts. Part 1, about Uttarakhand Environment Movement, philosophy, leadership, different branches. Part 2, misplaced priorities and development strategies in Uttarakhand. Part 3, alternative suggested by UN. Chapter 9 is suggestion and recommendations. I have made 3 kinds of suggestions. Number 1 for policymakers, number 2 for researchers, and number 3 for practitioners and activists. Now I'll go in detail about the chapter and then finding of each chapter. This chapter 1, Introduction. This chapter introduced the research subject beside giving a glimpse of the historical background and the regional factor that led to the emergence of environment movement. It also introduced prominent component of the Uttarakhand environment movement. It briefly discussed the rationale behind adopting 3 case studies from the viewpoint of environmental sociology. Chapter 2, Literature Review and Theoretical Perspective. The chapter is divided into subheadings: Strategies of Development in India in the Post-Independence Period, comparison between Socialist and Sarvodaya model, Post-Independence Strategy of Development and Industrialization, critical analysis of 5-year plans, the rise of alternative or people science movement, Gandhian critique and the significance of alternative, environment versus development, industrialization, the case of hilly region of Uttarakhand, the conflict between environment, health, and development in the hilly region. This chapter discusses the impact of giant industrialization project on the regional ecosystem. This chapter also traces the historical context, the origin, and the trajectory of the environmental movement in Uttarakhand. This chapter is concluded with the theoretical understanding that the Uttarakhand environment movement is a manifestation of Gandhian critique of Nehru's development model. The Gandhian analysis of the Nehruvian development model has played a crucial role in the formation and culmination of Uttarakhand movement. Environmental movement. Uttarakhand environmental movement was motivated by Gandhi's Sarvodaya development model, not only in its style of functioning, but on an intellectual and ideological level too. It also has presented a viable critique and alternative to the Nehruvian development model. Chapter 4, Global Environmental Movement and Trend in Developing Countries. This chapter discusses the world environmental consciousness in the context of religion, history, and culture. It traces the global history of environmental movement. It also makes an attempt to trace the environmental conservation movement in other parts of the globe. It focuses on environmental movement in India in 20th century. Then it focuses on the factors behind the genesis of Uttarakhand environment movement as well as its socio-economic circumstances. The chapter concludes with the understanding that the environmental consciousness in Europe and other parts of the developed world resulted from the overexploitation of natural resources and its impact on life in terms of unhealthy air, polluted water, or devastating flood. The environmentalism emerged in Western industrial societies only after addressing concern about resource quality due to technological choices and scientific resources. Environmental movement in the third world are not exactly concerned with the environmental issues, but are manifestation of flawed development policies, politics, endemic poverty, unemployment, and human survival. The movement in developed world have undoubtedly impacted the rest of countries. However, in the third world nation in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, including India, the movement has evolved organically on account of their colonial history. In these countries, environmental movements were organized by poor to safeguard and preserve their livelihood resources by resisting the monopoly of foreign rulers on their natural wealth. Eventually, these movements either turned into movement for national liberation or played a significant role in empowering the national freedom struggle movement. In South Asia, the countries from India to Burma, now Myanmar, resisted the Britishers' exploitative forest policies. This indigenous people movement motivated people from various strata of society to align with them and consolidate the resistance further. The campaign for safeguarding livelihood resources evolved into an anti-establishment movement or freedom movement. The third world environmental conflict expressed demand for socio-political, economic reform. The environmental movement of India and all other third world countries are actually environmentalism by the poor. Environmentalism in third world countries is a struggle for survival, and it is true in case of Uttarakhand. The environmental movement or the civil society resistance in this developing country is primarily a battle for accessing resources. Chapter 5, Environmental Movement in India. This chapter briefly discusses the following movement that shaped the environmental movement in India. The Bishnoi movement of Kajari village, Rajasthan, Apico movement of Karnataka, the Silent Valley movement, Kerala, Fish Worker movement, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Save Narmada Valley movement, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Save Niyamgiri movement, Odisha, Anti-POSCO movement, Odisha, Save Chilika movement, Odisha, the rise of the Uttarakhand environmental movement, that Uni Uttarakhand. After carefully analyzing the teaching of different religions in India, the chapter concludes with the understanding that the environment or nature is part and parcel of socio-religious and cultural life of Indian society. Almost every religion or culture has at least one ritual associated with worshipping or protecting nature. All religions have consciousness that nature is an act of divinity. All believe that God or the supreme power has created it. Furthermore, almost everyone expect their follower to respect nature in different form and with varying degree of clarity or detail. Hindus worship nature in different form. They believe in the philosophy that every particle has God. Preservation and protection of nature are part of Hindu way of life. Hindu worship the sun, air, earth, tree, plant, forest, river, and every living being for their role in the natural biosphere. Respect for wildlife, including lion, peacock, and snakes, form an essential aspect of the Hindu culture. Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, non-injury to living being, the fundamental concept of Jainism have been manifested in the modern philosophy of environmentalism. Buddhists believe in non-violence, meditation in natural surroundings, and respect and compensation towards all living beings, including trees. Collectively, this form the conservationist philosophy. Followers of Islam believe that they are two earth stewards, so they are not to misuse anything in nature, as God, Allah, does not love those who waste. Proactively conserving and preserving the natural environment is Muslims' religious philosophy, religious duty, and fundamental responsibility. Christians also believe in the stewardship of God's creation, and taking care of it is their responsibility. Sikhs believe they must safeguard nature, not just for the present generation, but also for future generations. Religion has been India's strongest belief system for thousands of years. Although most religions have nature as an integral part of their philosophies, human society continues exploring and exploiting nature and its components. Religion had developed environmental consciousness among the people. The Bishnoi movement of Rajasthan is a classic example of religious teachings manifestation in safeguarding the environment. Many movements in India never claimed to be environmental movement, yet their action and consciousness often culminated in awareness of environmental consciousness. Action and consequences often culminated in awareness of environmental consciousness. India has thousands of examples of environmental activism among the indigenous communities, like the Bishnoi movement in the desert region of Rajasthan, as mentioned earlier. Chipko movement in the Himalayan region of Uttarakhand, Apiko movement in Karnataka, Silent Valley movement in Kerala, Jangal Bachao movement in Jharkhand, Narmada Bachao movement in Madhya Pradesh, Anti-Tere Dam movement in Uttarakhand are the movement of poor people for their survival or livelihood. Each movement conveys distinct, specific, and meaningful philosophical belief to be the world. In one way or the other, each of these movements had root in indigenous culture and religious teaching and practices. A deep probe into the environmental movement in India makes it clear that these encompasses the struggle for livelihood and the struggle for determining traditional right on natural resources. Although in the recent past, there have been some constructive environmental movements that have started, these are not opposed to anything in particular. On the contrary, they successfully use their limited resource means and capabilities to create appropriate technology, promote organic farming, plant trees, clean rivers, revive dried rivers, and undertake water harvesting projects. The environmental movement in Uttarakhand is the manifestation of people's resistance against the British forest policy. In the name of forest management, forest science manipulated agriculture practices. It systematically regulated man entry into the forest and classified man as the enemy of the forest. These policies were kept continued in independent India. Jawaharlal Nehru's famous statement, "Modern industries are the temple of modern India," smoothened the way for urban-centered development. Industries needed water and energy. Urban centers also needed water and electricity. So the natural resources were diverted to meet the growing demand for energy and water of cities. The rural centers started dying. The household production system got settled. This forced peasant, tribal, and displaced villagers to start the campaign to safeguard their right over nature and natural resources. Thus, the environmental movement in India is primarily the environmentalism of the poor. Chapter 6, Forest Management and Rise of Chipko Movement in Uttarakhand. This chapter reviewed and studied the following aspects. Different acts related to forest management from Indian Forest Charter 1855 to Forest Conservation Act 1980 and 1988. Chipko movement in Chamoli district of Uttarakhand. Chipko movement's historical factor, the social and economic condition of the region, the exploitation of local people from the Chipko movement, and the betrayal of hope of the protesting community. The genesis of Chino Japto, Snatch and Grab movement. This chapter also discusses how the Chino Japto movement was an extension of the Chipko movement. This chapter also dwells on the ideological differences in the Chipko movement, besides debating the choice between environment and survival. The condition of the Chipko movement and the changes it went through. The chapter also discusses the changes in forest management and forest laws after the Chipko movement. The chapter concludes with the following observation and learning. The Britishers officially started their forest activities or inclusion in the forest with the introduction of Forest Charter 1855. The Forest Charter of 1855 was the British government's first official and organized attempt to regulate and protect forests from so-called exploitation. The British government claimed that it had solid scientific understanding and knowledge needed for the conservation and protection of forest resources. Britishers' action changed the pattern of natural resource consumption and influenced the community's approach toward natural resources, especially the forest. Indian Forest Act of 1865 gave immense power to the ruling establishment to declare any piece of land with tree cover as forest. However, it did not override the community and individuals' existing right over it. The Britishers curtailed the community and individual right over the forest with the successive forest policies. The Indian Forest Act 1878, is written in 1978. It is 1878 and 1894. The Indian Forest Act 1878 was more rigid, stringent, and anti-poaching. Under the disguise of scientific forestry, classification and conservation of forest practices, Britishers commercially exploited forests and tried to prevent the general population from access to forest resources. The practice of conserving forests continues today for different reasons. Its origin lies in Britishers' desire to secure their commercial interests by limiting the local population's access to forest, which subsequently became a cause for local resentment against the forest management system. In the first decade of the 20th century, there were widespread movement against the forest management system in the Kumaon region of Uttarakhand. This compelled the Britishers to establish the Kumaon Forest Grievances Committee in 1921 to address the local population's concern and grievances. This committee suggested the formation of one panchayat. British colonial forest policy and independent India's first forest policy, 1952, systematically curtailed forest-dependent communities' traditional right and role. Uttarakhand is a border state where the community's alienation from forest is as dangerous as its conflict with the forest department. Evacuating villages on account of rising migration may benefit the natural environment and surrounding wildlife, but it has severe implications for India's border security. The Chipko movement started in Chamoli district of Uttarakhand, claimed the local traditional right and resist the forest department's policy. The movement also highlighted the conflict people felt in following the Nehruvian socialist development model in opposition to Gandhi's Sarvodaya philosophy. The Chipko movement is not a reactionary event. The seed of the movement was sown and germinated for the long time. Chipko movement was the culmination of hundreds of locally autonomous initiatives and was primarily led by women to safeguard their forests and natural resources for subsistence and welfare of the local communities. The devastating flood in the Alaknanda River in 1971 and the government's decision to auction trees for commercial felling brought to the surface the decades of local resentment via the rainy struggle on 26 March 1974. The Chipko movement was essentially a manifestation of local population's deep-rooted need for sustaining communities' involvement with forest and natural resources. However, it later transformed into an ecological movement rooted in the politics of distribution of cost and benefit. The leadership was visible among the men, but the women were the real strength of backbone of the movement. It is clear from the analysis of the Forest Act and policies that generating revenue and accessing forest produce was the main motto of the Forest Department during the British period and independent India. An analysis of India's forest policies revealed that no meaningful changes occurred in forest policies in India during 150 years of forest management until the onset of Chipko movement in 1974. The Forest Conservation Act 1980 was a paradigm shift in the government's understanding of the forest ecosystem. The first time the government agreed that the forest should not be exploited for the commercial interests of the industry. The primary role of forest is to conserve and maintain the regional ecosystem besides providing for the subsistence need of the local communities. After the Chipko movement, the government of India started exerting its control on forests. It prohibited using forest land for non-forest purpose without prior permission from the government of India. This was manifested in the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, which allowed the central government to restrict the state from using forest land for non-forest purpose without its approval. Three kinds of ideologies were present in the movement. The first, led by Sarvodaya leader Chandi Prasad Bhatt, was in favor of generating employment through forest resources. They were not against forest felling, but they demanded to develop a system so that these forest resources generate employment opportunities for the local people. They were with the thought that at least primary processing or semi-finished product should be made near the forest. The second ideology was Marxist, represented by Govind Singh Rawat, who was against the contract system in the forest department. Instead, he favored giving wood cutting work to a labor union or labor cooperative. The third ideology was the women, led by Gaura Devi. They favored saving trees and forests. They coined the slogan that the forest is their motherhood, which gives them food, fiber, fuel, wood, grass, and water. However, as the movement progressed, new actors with new terminology and slogans joined the movement. The classical Chipko workers heard new words: deep ecology, ecofeminism, conservation, etc. Nevertheless, among the Sarvodaya activists, an ideological shift developed in 1980. One group led by Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Gaura Devi proceeded with the strategy and demanded for an ecologically judicious participatory forest development strategy. They demanded that the forest management system work in sync with the need of local communities. Sarla Bain, Sarvodaya leader and ideologue of the Chipko movement, rejected the idea of Himalayan forest as a state revenue source. Instead, she advocated that the Himalayan forest range should be seen as a resource for balancing the adverse climatic condition of northern India. The idealist group led by Sundarlal Bahuguna was more focused on the ideas of environmental protection and scientific management of forests without the active participation of local communities. Sundarlal Bahuguna was against the idea of forest-based industries in the hills and promoted the idea of stopping all the tree felling activity in the Himalayan region. This ideological conflict between different groups shifted the discourse of the movement from sustainable regional development or activities to fully ecological welfare. This ideological conflict led the movement to an untimely death. In 1982, the government declared the Upper Alaknanda watershed as the Nanda Devi biosphere. Furthermore, it declared it an eco-sensitive zone, restricting all human intervention. This made the community helpless and speechless, and the local community's economy and livelihood system shattered. Thus, Gaura Devi and Gobind Singh Rawat started movement against the Nanda Devi biosphere area with the name Chino Jhabto. The Chipko movement could not raise the fundamental question of Forest Act and the community's right over it. The outsider in the name of journalist or environmentalist diverted the basic theme of the Chipko movement. Today, very few more organizations are raising the forest right issue. However, they are still just asking for access to forest resources like fuel, wood, fodder, etc. Nobody is raising the fundamental question of amendment in the Act and government order. Chapter 7, Hydropower Projects in Uttarakhand, Case Study of Tehri Dam. The study aimed to arrive at tangible solution for human development by exploring the debate in favor of and against dam construction activity. This thesis is divided into three primary parts. The first part strives to glimpse into the history of river water uses, the history of hydropower generation, the conceptualization of dam, and the factor behind opposition to dam. The second part of this chapter reviews the Tehri Dam built in the Tehri district at the confluence of Bhagirathi and Vilaganga River as a case study. The study analyzed the factor behind the opposition to this dam, including the anti-dam movement in general and the history of anti-dam movement in Tehri region. It also reviewed the recommendation of various government-constituted committees on improving the functioning of hydropower plant. The last part of chapter studies the question Tehri Dam protesters raised and how they have influenced the hydropower project in the Himalayan region, especially in Uttarakhand state. The researchers has also tried to evaluate through this chapter the government outlook and policies toward using national water resources. This chapter also discusses the trajectory of anti-Tehri Dam movement and how it has influenced the subsequent policy decision in the region. The study concluded with the following observation and finding. Large-scale public projects have failed in fairly distributing the cost and benefit of development activities among its citizens while disrupting the regional ecosystem because of ill-conceived plans. This has spurred public fear and resentment toward development projects and led to anti-dam movement. The concern over inequitable sharing of cost and benefit of development projects have spurred the anti-Tehri Dam movement. The anti-Tehri Dam movement is the manifestation where local communities protested against the little development in the region after 4 decades of giving up their land holding, houses, traditional natural resources, based livelihood. The local movement against the Tehri Dam project was complex with contradictory ideological position and strategies. The movement was led by Gandhian, supported by royalists, and influenced by individual ambitions and topical politics. In 1965-66, the movement started under Bandh Prabhavit Janta Sangharsh Samiti, Dam Affected Public Committee, and converted it as the Bandh Virodhi Sangharsh Samiti, Anti-Tehri Dam Committee in 1978, within 1 decade. 4-decade-long struggle can be divided into 5 phases. During its first phase, the movement activism was limited to saving their land and villages. The movement leader at that time favored the construction of small-scale dam or shifting the project to a different site. During this period, the movement was led by representatives of the local population. They were primarily concerned about communities getting uprooted from their environment. The first phase, immediate concern was minimizing losses to the local community and their natural environment. The second phase of the movement started with the formation of Tehri Bandh Virodhi Sangharsh Samiti in 1978. The Tehri Bandh Virodhi Sangharsh Samiti enlarges the focus from a local problem to a larger geographical and environmental safety issue that would have consequences for the entire North Indian belt. The third phase of the movement started in 1989 when its leader Birendra Das Saklani fell ill and Sundarlal Bahuguna took over as the new leader of the movement. Bahuguna's persona was more prominent than Saklani's. A good orator, he was the recipient of many awards, including the Jamnalal Bajaj Award and Right Livelihood Award. His charisma introduced diverse people and new jargon to the movement. Seismicity, cost-benefit ratio, environmental impact, anthropology, ecology, biodiversity, and civil engineering became the new buzzword for anti-dam movement activists. The movement leader Sundarlal Bahuguna was gaining recognition from international environmentalists. However, in the Tehri region, many people, especially contractors, material suppliers, transporters, and local politicians came to support the Tehri Dam. In the fourth phase of the anti-Tehri Dam movement, the focus shifted from key issues to follow the agenda of its charismatic leader. Sundarlal Bahuguna started questioning the Nehruvian development model as a whole and offered Gandhi's Sarvodaya ideology as a suitable alternative. By launching the Save the Himalaya campaign, Bahuguna broadened the scope of anti-Tehri Dam movement to global appeal. The Save the Himalaya movement advocated for a small-scale hydro project that did not interfere with the river flow. In addition, it advocated for the rural economy and regional ecosystem by promoting afforestation and agroforestry practices. During the last phase of the anti-Tehri Dam movement, Bahuguna relied heavily on his Save the Himalayan campaign. He sought a permanent ban on the construction of large dams in the mountainous region. He advocated for developing a tourism-led economy and tapping natural resources only to feed the regional population's essential requirement. Bahuguna sought to galvanize new support by appealing to religious sentiment. While making a case for the Save Himalaya movement, he argued that any development in the region could only be successful if it respected the local culture and sentiment. He argued that the mega dam and mining projects are destructive to the region and that development projects which centered around natural resources but did not heavily exploit them alone had the potential for providing sustainable solution to the region's problem. He sought to strengthen the scientific argument for not reducing the flow of Ganga river by encouraging the revival of centuries-old tradition of worshipping the holy river. So it was the classic shift from saving lives and livelihood of the local community to opposing the dam on scientific indicator and finally exploring religious sentiments supporting the opposition to the dam project. Despite many controversies, the Tehri Hydro project was approved in March 1994 and got commissioned during 2006-07. 2 units of Kotisar hydroelectric power were commissioned in March 2011, while the 3rd and 4th unit were commissioned in January 12 and March 12 respectively. Currently, it is generating 1400 megawatt of electricity and is expected to start operating at its full capacity by 2400 megawatts soon. The prolonged resistance to Tehri Dam construction started a debate on improving mega development projects, environmental safety, and rehabilitation processes. The anti-Tehri Dam movement made the public aware of many socio-economic, cultural, and political factors that influence the development and distribution of hydropower, especially in Uttarakhand, which has a diverse ecosystem and challenging geographical conditions. The Uttarakhand government implemented a policy paper in 2002 and decided to harness hydropower with a small dam or runoff rivers scheme. The objective of this policy is to use environmental friendly means to generate and supply electricity to remote villages in Uttarakhand. January 2008 policy paper on hydropower development envisages community participation in harnessing renewable energy resources. Registered societies in Uttarakhand are allowed via Gram Panchayat to generate electricity through self-identified projects. It was decided not to allow any new mega dam construction while old projects are allowed to complete. Chapter 8, Uttarakhand Environment Movement and Emergence of Alternative. The Uttarakhand Environment Movement had developed environmental consciousness in the general public, but it also intervened in Uttarakhand's politics, economy, and social and cultural identity. As a result, the Uttarakhand Environmental Movement eventually turned into separate statehood movement. Three schools of thought emerged from the Uttarakhand environment movement. One school of thought led by Sundaral Bhavana has played a crucial role in catapulting environmental consciousness to the center stage of economic and political thinking. This group thus believe and advocate that the environmental conservation is the most crucial objective for all human society. This group propagated the slogan, ecology is the permanent economy. The second group, Congress and left-leaning activists, favored a middle path approach. This group requested that the government fulfill their demand like developing civic amenities and proper rehabilitation of the affected community. The third stream of Chipko movement led by Chandra Prasad Bhatt stayed loyal to the original plan and philosophy of Chipko movement. This group developed an ideology of establishing industry in the region and proposed that industries should also be established if trees are cut down in the mountains region. This group suggested that if there were constraints on developing a full-fledged industry in the region, at least semi-processing or pre-processing unit must be established in the hills. On November 9, 2000, the mountainous region of Uttar Pradesh was carved into a separate state, Uttarakhand. This gave activists a sense of belief and confidence that the state development model would now change to accommodate the concern of its people. However, this dream shattered soon as the environmental conservation law and forest laws did not leave any room to make radical changes. Instead, the imposition of new and more stringent restrictions worsened the situation. The government's development strategies and priorities appeared misplaced, contradictory, and confused. As a result, Uttarakhand's hilly region lagged in the development index. The migration in search of good education, health, service, and employment opportunities is still a significant issue in the hilly region. According to the first report of the Migration Commission 2018, 734 villages were entirely vacated by the inhabitants. These villages were called Bhutia villages or ghost villages, while in another 565 villages, the population fell by 50% between 2011 and 2017. This aggravated the demographic concern of mass migration and displacement. It is also a threat to national security. Despite continuous agitations opposing the development model and strategies applied in the Uttarakhand and the establishment of many successful alternative models, the government of Uttarakhand is still following the old development pattern. They still follow the Nehruvian model of big is best and prioritize the big project. Moreover, most policies and programs either contradict the government's stated position on environmental conservation or are different in the same situation in different locations or projects. The various development projects, including the Char Dham Highway Project, Rishikesh Karnaprayag Rail Project, Dehradun Airport Extension Project, and the Kordwar Kandi Road Project, have exposed the gap in government's understanding of the Himalayan region. Uttarakhand is a border state, which makes it convenient for the government to deflect criticism by linking all projects to compulsions of national security. When it comes to the securing national security interests, other concerns like environment protection, conservation of flora and fauna, local culture and economy, basic facilities in the border area, and human rights become second, thereby limiting space for constructive criticism. Yes, we need development and infrastructure, but securing residents' rights and safeguarding the ecology, flora and fauna is also pertinent. Uttarakhand need an alternative model, and in the given circumstances, keeping in mind the geographical constraints, the Sarvodaya model of decentralization is the best suited. Due to its challenging geography and fragile ecosystem, Uttarakhand need a decentralized model in the governance, production system, forest management, distribution of services, and electricity production and distribution. Chapter 9, Suggestion and Recommendation. The Himalayan glaciers are spread over about 17% of world's mountainous region. It is the source of 9 of Asia's vast river system. Therefore, a slight change in the climate has the potential to affect a large population's life and livelihood. The retreat of glaciers has recently changed the frequency, magnitude, and location of natural hazards. The young mountains, the Himalayas, have a very sensitive and fragile ecological system. The scale of ecosystem services that the Himalayas provide is almost unparalleled in human history. So it is necessary and non-negotiable to safeguard the interests of the Himalayas, its ecology, geography, and inhabitants. But even after 75 years of independence, the denizens of the Himalayas, especially the Uttarakhand Himalayas, are concerned about their development and keep agitating for one region or another. The government mistreated the local communities by uprooting people from their homes, diverting their river water to generate electricity, and preventing local from accessing forests in Uttarakhand. This lack of infrastructure development like village road, hospital, educational facilities, and other civic facilities has antagonized the locals. The separate statehood movement for Uttarakhand state was a classic example of expressing their agony and plight. The demand for the separate statehood movement was not only for political power, but also for an organic development model for this region. There are many direct and indirect disadvantages of the underdevelopment of the area, and migration is most prominent. The challenges to national security is the second indirect disadvantage of this. It is well accepted that border villages are the first line of national defense, and the empty villages in the border area are big challenge for national security. Moreover, the third significant consequence is that migration from villages lead to overcrowding in cities, increasing adverse pressure on urban infrastructure. The Himalayas does not mean non-living mountains, but a biosphere that includes its people, flora, and fauna. Most of the area in Uttarakhand consists of either forest or river valleys. Therefore, any development exercise in the region must be planned while considering these two natural resources. Human need energy. A tremendous amount of energy is hidden in the Himalayan river. Therefore, policymakers and planners should invest in finding alternatives to generate energy without or with minimum destabilizing the ecosystem. The decentralized way of electricity generation could be possible solution. Gandhi's concept of self-reliant, self-sufficient villages unit is intending as an alternative development model. The Himalayas and Uttarakhand have experimented with different models, resulting in the Himalayas having suffered enough already. However, in some cases, it has reached the point of no return. The Himalayas, the savior of the globe from global warming and climate change, need a new sustainability model. Now, it seems the last solution is the Sarvodaya model of a decentralized economy, village institution, and nature-centric development. It has the potential to give sustainability to the Himalayas. I'm just reading some main highlight of the study. The present study is based on the theoretical perspective of environmental sociology by considering the two environmental movements, anti-terror dam movement and chipko movement, as social movement. The study intends to explore the answer to development and science policy questions that can determine the interrelationship between development and the natural environment. Movement as well as the development alternatives suggested by it. It is more than an exercise in objective intellectualism. It is proactive research that offer straightforward suggestions on new policies for development. This study tried to make a matrix of correlation between the post-independence policy of the Government of India and Uttarakhand environment movement. This research attempt to decipher the balance between development and environmental health and make workable suggestions based on it. It uses three crucial movements of Uttarakhand: anti-terror dam movement, chipko movement, and all-weather road project as case studies. This research attempt to understand the discourse between environment and development. It explores the nature and character of environmental movement in the Uttarakhand region. It draws a correlation matrix between Uttarakhand environment movement and Uttarakhand separate statehood movement. The factors behind the Uttarakhand environment movement, the regional development alternatives that have emerged and outcome of the Uttarakhand environment movement, the suitable policy for sustainable and inclusive development for fragile and sensitive Himalayan region. Thank you very much for hearing. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Prem, for making a very comprehensive presentation. And now I request our distinguished external member, Professor Dhirendra Gangwalji, you have your comment. Yeah, comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Govindji, and thank you, Prem Bokhandi, for making such an elaborate and detailed presentation. Yeah, the thesis, I will be brief, and because you have already elaborated and given detail of various things. So you are looking at environmental movement not just as a critique, but as an alternative as well, which I found interesting, and we will further discuss it as I go ahead. I like your initial chapters, very interesting on developmental model. You have thoroughly discussed the Nervian model and its critique, and particularly the way you discussed the Ghanaian Sarvodaya and Antodaya schemes and all that. It was very interesting. Very few people now reflect on those kind of issues. So I found it very, very interesting in the beginning of the thesis. But later on, for example, global environmental movements chapter, I think it was loosely connected because what one expect from this kind of work is that at the best you could have seen the link between Indian and global movements, or how the global movements possibly influence Indian movements. That would have been enough, maybe a part of a chapter rather than devoting that much whole chapter to this kind of thing. And same thing I will say to the your review of the environmental movements in India, that is chapter 5, where again there were a lot of information. I appreciate your going through so many literature and bringing important things over there. But focus was then missing, because we need a link that how ultimately those are leading to your finished and good chapter, which are coming to us end of it. That is from chapter 6 onward, particularly chapter 6, 7, and 8 are your main chapters, which I think in the thesis. So coming first to that, rather than coming to the first part of it, quite a few issues we can discuss later on. Coming to the Chipko movement, you have said a lot of things about it, and interestingly, but in my reading in the thesis, I saw you more focusing on Rainy rather than other places where the movement was also important and effective, like discussion on Badiyargarh is missing, which gives slightly different kind of taste of the movement. Similarly, focus on Uttarakhand, Sanghas Bahini is very, very limited and all that. Why I'm saying that? Because you are constantly arguing in many places that this is eco-feminist movement. Well, some scholars have seen it like that, but some of the authority on the movement who have closely examined it do not see that happening. In Gauradevi, of course, played very important role in Deni, but that was a specific situation and a circumstance. I'm not saying that women have no interest in that, or they didn't play a role. They play, but the leadership of the movement in most of the cases, unfortunately, one can say at that point of time. But today, in the Uttarakhand movement, women were on the forefront of the whole thing. But they were not on the leadership position. So, scholar whether Ramchandra Guha or even the Shekhar Pathak, they are hesitant to say it as an eco-feminist movement. So, I would like to have your response on that. Apart from that, what you are saying, very interesting things in your this chapter are that that the Chipko movement, of course, had a great idealism, and many people see it as a great success and all that. But many people in Uttarakhand, and as you have rightly mentioned, that they saw that what they intended to and what they wanted did not happen. Quite contrary things happened, because a lot of restrictions were imposed, and the model of Chandi Prasad Bhatt kind of things, that the local access to resources shall be there, and the people will uh, use the resources, and that local focus on the resources shall remain was no longer there, because the way the government read it, one can say that certain activists played it that way, or maybe the globally it was perceived and the government followed more that kind of line. It became a more and more a movement which seems to was demanding a conservation of forests rather than also looking at the livelihood of the people, where this misreading led to a lot of problem, as we see very well in your thesis as well, where you are emphasizing it. And that people found it problematic. But then you are drawing several conclusions from that. For example, well, though the Japto movement comes slightly late in the context of when the national parks began to be created, and national parks are more harsh in terms of the kind of restriction they impose than the forest policy itself was imposing prior to that, which is possibly resulting into resentment, a huge set of resentment. And then you are seeing that the Chino Japto kind of movements. But my question to you, because I want to know more about all these things, how widespread is it? Is it confined to Rainy or one or two villages nearby? We need to look into this. First, I will confine myself to this, then I will move to the next chapters. Can I get your response on these early observations so that we can move to other chapters? I will not put all the things together. That will make it a bit confusing. Yeah.
Sir, interestingly, I'm not in favor of saying that it was a eco-feminist movement. I never said this. It's eco-feminism. Eco-feminism word was put by Panna Shiva and Guru, and all the environmentalists were, I mean, urban-centric environmentalists. It was basically a pigeon movement. What Professor Ramgua and Sekhar Pathak said, that it was basically for their right over natural resources. The Chandi Prasad Bhatt group was not, even I never said that it is an environmental movement. I said it's a movement that was focused for seeking their right over natural resources or creating some industries on that area. So I never said that it is a eco-feminist movement. Eco-feminism was a new buzzword heard by after this 1978 or 75, 77, 78 onward. The second thing, Chino Japto movement was confined to only to that Rani, Lata, and other places. Not it couldn't go beyond that because it was directly affected the people from Bhutia tribe from that area. Now, again, from last few days, I mean, some 15 days back, government has decided to make one helipad at the height of 15,000 mean sea level at Himkund Sahib area. And people are opposing that. So again, the Chino Japto people are active in that area only. So it is basically confined within that Rani, Lata, and Bhutia area. So not spread in other part. I was part of that movement.
So if I'm allowed to go ahead, can I raise a few more things? So for example, now moving to the next chapter, your Tehri Dam movement. Interestingly, you brings many interesting information into this. But I'm focusing more on when you look at the failure of the movement. Is primarily you are assigning the reason for the failure of the movement to the leadership. And even this transition from this early phase of asking for rehabilitation and then converting it into the anti-dam movement, that shift not so nicely drawn. It could have been done more better way. But my more interest here is that how one can read it only as a failure of the leadership. Particularly, what I wish that you would have done here and would have make it more interesting is to draw parallel with the Narmada Bachao Andolan. A comparison was required here. What could have given you a solid ground to look into the two movements, their latest nature, the reason why they could not prevent the dam from building. This I think that you need to reflect in future. Here you have done already a fantastic work, whatever you have to do in given the condition that you picked it up after 20 years and produce a good thesis in spite of that. But would you like to reflect that on the one hand, if you see that, well, maybe the Bahuguna took the central stage in the anti-dam movement, and then many other people who were participating in this, then it started deserting the movement because the focus became on Bahuguna, as you rightly said, and that's perfectly correct because so many fasts he took and whole attention was saving his life. And he was talking about the larger and much broader issues than simply focusing on the dam. So do you think that this is the only reason, though you one place you also talks about nicely that how this rehabilitation packages later on, providing job to people who are getting affected, all that slowly also made the anti-dam kind of things more diluted and with assistance coming from USSR. That phase in later on, late 80s or early 90s, the very nature of the movement started changing. And there were isolated people who were protesting. Am I correct in the reading it like this? And how you will see in this context the Navda Bachao Andolan, because the failure, can we also assign that to the failure of the leadership, or is there some other kind of factors that are there when we discuss the anti-dam movement? Thank you.
So interestingly, you and me both are from that area, and we know this sociology better than so we have faced that sociology. Once this question was asked by Medha Patkarji to me in Gandhi Peace Foundation, why people in Tehri Dam movement are not behind Sundaral Bognaji, while people in Narmada Bachao are still behind her. Same question was that in our area, people are mostly, if we'll go to the sociology, upper caste people, more going towards getting money and buying land in Dehradun and other places. More of the people were in government jobs and they were just going towards the government jobs and other places. While in Narmada Valley, most of the people, affected people are tribals, peasant, those have direct relation with the natural resources, water, fish workers, and other things. So this was the main issue in Uttarakhand. What happened in 1986, I guess, when this dam project was rejected? You are a historian, so you know better than me. When this project was rejected by government of India, I guess Dr. T.N. Session was Secretary Environment that time, and he rejected. I mean, government rejected that after SK State Committee's report. It was rejected. In between, Gorbachev came to India, and they gave some money to this movement. I mean, to build Terry Dam. In the meantime, what happened? Bachiram Konswal was a CPM leader, district committee secretary, and was secretary to the anti-Terry Dam movement. All the CPI people, they left that movement, and then it became totally the Gandhian movement. So that Sundarlal Bhaguna came into the picture. Saklani ji fell ill. He was very old. And then it became very persona centric, and Bhaguna ji was, him better than me. He used to go in the fast, and then whole movement was discussing about saving his life and like that. So this was the another reason for failure. People in general didn't support that movement. They were more likely to get projects from, contracts from Terry Dam, getting land in Dehradun, Haridwar, getting job, and going beyond that area. So this is the main reason what I found, the failure of this project. And then Bhaguna in the end, he went to the Vishwa Hindu Parishad in 2000, around 2000. And Vishwa Hindu Parishad people intervened that. And they said that the Ganga ki jo dhara hai, aviral behni chahiye. So that was again a case. Then there was a small stream was made from Terry Dam, directly to the meeting at Deprya. So due to this, they started from dam Parvahit people's resistance to religious movement, and it was the main reason for failure. This ideological shift was the main reason of failure. And they could not, the Terry Dam movement could not generate support from the people from Meerut, Muzaffarnagar, Haridwar, Rishikesh, all those people which would be affected by destruction of that. So that is the reason for it.
Okay. My last question in this series before Professor Binu Paul comes in. This is your last chapter. You say that environment movement in Uttarakhand, you are using it as a singular rather than plural, and you are discussing a multiple kind of things there. I will come later on again on that as well. But here my question is that, what are the similarity between the CHIPCO and the anti-Tehri Dam movement? And how they can be put together or compare? Because my understanding is that CHIPCO is a much larger kind of movement, because this affected each and every family in Uttarakhand, because forest, people dependence on forests were there for everyone. And this 100 years restriction and more, and even in the independent India, the way the people were being treated as far as their rights in forests were concerned. So that was what in the CHIPCO, the resentment was there. Again, I agree that there were locations where it happened, but maybe the much larger audience were possibly available for the moment. People had a wider concerns with, because everyone was getting affected from that. While the Tehri Dam affected limited number of people, obviously in the Bhagirathi Valley where the dam was being built. Whether it has resonance elsewhere in Uttarakhand, I'm talking about the people, not talking about the leader or intellectual or ecologist and all that. Because the last chapter, in a way, very nice chapter, you are trying to look into the people or their perspective or alternative, and so many things are emerging there. So I think comparing two, one has to be very, very careful, because CHIPCO has a very different take. And anti-Tehri Dam movement was slightly different kind of. It could have become a popular movement for all the people, but it could not possibly only in the valley or somewhere people protested. How many marches they took? How many marches they took outside the region? I don't much understand. You may be knowing better because you are activist as well. But my understanding is that remain confined to the valley only, to the people who are directly getting affected. Other people may write, may raise voices, but could not be said to be the popular movement like the Chipko was. So your response to this, and then over to Professor Paul.
So thank you very much. You have already answered this question. Yes, you are right that Chipko movement was more of the movement where people from the whole Uttarakhand was part of that, or they were the participant in one or the other way. While in case of Tere Dam movement, it was confined in the, that valley only. This is what I told in last statement, that they could not generate support from the people of Haridwar, Rishikesh, and other plain area like Muzaffarnagar, Meerut. They're supposed to take that advantage of these people to get support for Tere Dam movement. So you are right. You are right that Chipko movement was more of movement of the Uttarakhand. Even today, we are trying to analyze Chipko movement to get to make a new development strategies or to make new project new strategy for the development of the Uttarakhand.
Yeah, Professor Venupal, thank you, Dinji. Professor Venupal, you have given very comprehensive report, and I have also gone through it. And after the presentation of Prem, so you might have some queries. You have raised some queries, but after listening his presentation, probably you can have some more observation and queries.
Thank you, Professor Govind. First of all, Prem, it has been very interesting presentation, as well as the thesis provides interesting insights. Why I say insights? Because one reason is you have been able to synthesize history of movements, especially the content pertinent to it, and the relevant policy content as well, and its history. And the third dimension, so voices from the field, that too multidimensional in nature. So its synthesis, what I found out, I tried my best to discard what lies there, what I understood. Some questions I do have. You come up with three major dimensions and putting the institutional history in it and its variations over the years. One dimension is livelihood, another is conservation, and the third is sustainability. Very, very tough to converge anyway. But I think what you present in the history, particularly UEM, Uttarakhand and Environment Movement, one stage institutions seem to align with what do you call it, corner solution. This is a very very interesting word, the theory of optimization. Corner solution in the sense, while sustainability, livelihood, not sustainability came later, I guess. Livelihood and its social life was not ignored, I would say. That was not the priority. Priority was ecological. So the whole attention was on it. But then that seems to have created some disturbance in the equilibrium in which institutional process was situated. Actually, that might have impacted the sustenance of institutional processes. If something like a linear movement was foreseen, but then it got disrupted somewhere, because booth village is also an important concern. But as you rightly mentioned, ecology is extremely fragile. So the question is, can we move away from corner situations of this sort? Or is there interesting examples of institutional alignments or institutional systems that responds to solutions other than cornerstones? Because the problem with cornerstones, this is there everywhere. I think classic case people cite, I don't know how far it's worth citing, but near my district in Kerala, Idukki district, has a sanctuary, a Periyar Tiger Sanctuary, which is often cited as a case of ecotourism. They found a conflict between conservation priorities and local livelihoods, in other words. But eventually what happened was ecotourism project could elicit out the talent of locals over there who were involved in poaching earlier. They became naturalists, so-called naturalists, and their knowledge was utilized to engage in ecotourism projects. I'm not saying that's a good example of synthesis, but it's an attempt to move away from corner solution. Corner means you say livelihood zero, full conservation, or conservation is least regarded, but livelihood is given. But then it's a very tricky issue. So my first question, before coming to the second question, first question is, what do you see as an institutional design that can respond to this kind of issues and synthesize and also bring back life to Booth Village? You mentioned what is its potential hazard. The second part is about, you mentioned the orientation of Uttarakhand environmental movement. Although there was a common purpose right from the beginning, one interesting word you used I liked. That was Gandhian evaluation of Nehruvian projects. That went on, but then later it spun off new variants as well. But now the question, very crucial question, again, it's there in your thesis. This, see, hydroelectric project is a reality now. It's a reality. There's so much done, but then it's also a question of core and satellite economic structure. Most of electricity supply that emanates from these projects goes to metropolitan cities and other areas, downstream areas. Whereas upstream, you mentioned, I guess, in your thesis, upstream people endure the cost, displacement cost, as well as there's a problem of paying for the electricity. Whereas I think you mentioned, I think, downstream places like Delhi, people get free electricity. So is it crucial to have a fiscal design to think of appropriate returns back to people? That would, I'm not saying it's like a typical compensation structure, but it's a question of, it's a discourse, the context for a discourse. So what is also a design for that? Of course, the political willpower is very crucial over there, but it's like a core satellite core economy. I mean, theory of underdevelopment looks into it. They have been presenting it. Of course, it's not given much importance now, but then I think it's very crucial in the regional balances, because upstream, downstream, it's like a very interesting value chain, meta-organizational system, wherein there is upstream, downstream connect is existent. But then the question is, who benefits out of it? That's also another crucial point. The third part I would like to bring to your point is, these institutions were not, what do you call it, stagnant. You mentioned, I mean, you amply brought that out through narrative, field narratives, voices, also extracts of the history, variety of ways you have done it. But the question is there going to be an imaginary saddle point, at least in terms of design, which can accommodate multiple interests, elicit out and lead to common interest? Because sustainability is going to be a common interest, because the glacier melting is going to generate a massive complexity. So what about that? So these are three of my questions, reflections. But then to encapsulate the whole thing, I read it with great interest. It enlightened me. I learned it. So it's an immense learning for me. Thank you. Over to you.
Ren would like to respond.
So thank you very much. You have already answered many questions what you raise, and definitely we need a different model, and the model is only decentralized, should be a small model. Like people in our area, we have smaller in height, so we need a smaller project in size. In case of capital and geographical area, should be a smaller. We need electricity, as I told you that, but we need some different kind of system, and like making a small dam, small projects, runoff river kind of projects in Uttarakhand. Sustainability is the biggest issue. Yes. The other thing is that in whole thesis and the whole movement, I never find that people are more concerned about conservation and all these things. People in general are more interested about their livelihood, and livelihood of the people in remote Himalayan state or in any urban, tribal area is already sustainable. They have sustainable model. So we need to replicate that model in that area. Institutional wise, government has to take, I mean, when we were fighting for the separate statehood movement, so we were just demanding the separate state of a district. This Udham Singh Nagar and Haridwar district was never part of our demand. Unfortunately, when this state was carved, these two areas were just given in Uttarakhand. And then again, this whole model that was already implemented in UP was just replicated here as a common copy in Uttarakhand. So we need a decentralized model, which is, again, I told in my thesis that this is the only Sarvodaya model. Village-based model is the only model we can take. And then you told about this eco-tourism. Abruzzo, I guess Abruzzo in Italy is a classical example of a national park. So we must do that. We are just fighting for that, but unfortunately, nothing is happening. Right. Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Krishna have seen this thesis from the very beginning, and he has seen that how it has matured, how it has taken the shape. So I would like to have his comment on this.
Actually, first of all, Baukhandi has put in a lot of effort, and actually with a number of limitations within which Baukhandi had to undertake this thesis after 18 or 19 years, and that too at a time when already some of the leading historians and environmental social scientists have already written on the whole environmental movements in India. And again, after 18, 19 years to take up and to relook into it was a very big task, and the limitations were there in terms of the kind of the synopsis, and we couldn't sort of change anything in between, even the topic and the case studies, because now that connects to some of the points which you made by both experts. We were very fortunate to have a historian and a development economist who already worked on the project and raised many of the important issues which were there. But we had to sort of look into the kind of this thing with these limitations, and I think Prem should take up some of the issues which were raised by both the experts while either if you are trying to publish the thesis or write papers. Take some of these critical comments into consideration. And given the kind of the very detailed and expertise comments, I think I've already gone through the thesis number of times, and I should say that Prem has done a reasonably an okay job for the thesis. One of the issues on which I thought that a little more emphasis could have been put was that we had these a large environmental movement. Similarly, we had the people science movement, we had the alternative science movement, and now we have seen in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years that many of these movements have taken different turns, So I would have wished that he would have put in a little bit more effort into what is happening in terms of what kind of streams the whole environmental movement has led to, because the leadership and the kind of the whole organization structure is no more there. It has taken into it has gone into a number of other streams, except that the last disaster what we had in Uttarakhand, only then we again remember some of the sort of the environmental movement, whether it is Bauguna and many of those. So some of those in terms of the whole alternative and how this movement has further taken root into different streams. Little bit more emphasis on that would have been good, but I think given the kind of the both historical and the kind of the contemporary history structure of the thesis, and also trying to address the issues of development and also connect it with science and technology policy analysis, I personally thought that he has done some kind of a reasonable work, and it's been completely ratified by the two experts. However, notwithstanding some of those, this thing, Prem, while writing the papers, I think should take some of these criticisms into consideration and take it very seriously. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. I think it's a very needful comment that you need to take into account. I think this is the beginning, and I also agree that he meets the basic requirements for a thesis, as our external examiners have also evaluated. In here, CSSP, we have some audience here. So now I request if any of you have any comments, suggestions. Dr. Bhaduri? Yeah. Yeah, you may come here and just say hello. Yeah. You can say hello to Professor Krishna, Professor Paul.
Hi, Krishna.
Hi.
Yeah. No, this was a very rich discussion, and I, in no way, I consider myself an expert on environmental issues, but I felt tempted to talk about it for two reasons. One is, my work on or interest on grassroots innovation and frugal innovation, and the second is my perceived closeness with Uttarakhand as a trekker or as a very frequent visitor of the place. I accept the fact, I mean, whenever I go to, the hills, I see this massive devastation of forest, and I also do not see much improvement in roads. And together they constitute a particular kind of, a paradox, I think. And it goes on and on. To me, I think a few points that Prem had mentioned and then later on came up in the conversation by the experts. It was about how to really visualize that alternative form of you call it development. Although development itself is a contested term, development has a very recent origin of the Second World War. Before that, nobody talked about development, etc., etc. Now, I do think that depending too much on religion or ideology can be a trap in today's situation, especially. Given the not only that our politics is becoming a bit difficult and different these days. I mean, you cannot really trace ideology with actions in that straightforward manner. What is Gandhism and how does it flow from ideology to action? We really do not see a very clear connection, and that is okay in a sense. I mean, the new experimentation must go on. But I do think this is a trap. Relying too much on ideology and religion can be a trap because it doesn't deal with people's aspirations. Now, the question is that in many occasions, I have seen in my research on frugal innovation or grassroots innovation, that even if there are good reason for a local innovation, people do not accept something which is second best. So if you call something a local innovation, people don't accept. Everybody wants the best. Okay. Now, so actually, I think an alternative developmental paradigm has to reconfigure some of these debates in terms of survival issues. And that is where perhaps, given that I know that Prem will remain in activism, scholastic activism, or maybe a bit of both, my suggestion would be that if Prem can, initiate, not by himself alone, but by a group of people who would be close to him, a good review of all the different narratives that have existed around the world about small-scale development. So you have the examples of solidarity economy in Latin America or in Brazil. You have the examples of rural reconstruction in Bengal, led by Rabindranath Tagore. You have the Perrier movement in the South. And there are multiples of such movements. There are movements in Italy, in southern part of Europe. I mean, my hunch is that if one can do a good review of these local narratives globally spread, maybe we can come up with a few parameters where the survival would be the main driving force and not ideology and religion. And maybe that can be an instrument to develop a more, alternative narrative of development or decentralized narrative of development that Prem is having in mind. Because decentralization per se may not be a solution. You can have a decentralized government, but the government follows the same narrative of a large-scale developmental pattern, etc., etc. The second and the final point that I have wanted to make is, once you bring this issue of religion and ideology somewhat sort of marginal to the discourse, not entirely marginal, but because of course in the narrative of welfareism also there is an ideology. But if you don't make it central, then the question of the knowledge would be an important part. And I probably because you started your PhD long ago, where these alternative knowledge theories were not so developed in late 90s or early 2000. So maybe my request would be that when you take it up for your publication, if you put some emphasis on these alternative forms of knowledge creation processes, their validation, their assessment, etc., etc., because I think the knowledge and survival can be two very strong pillars of that alternative narrative that that is in your mind, and that would fit the bill in the sense that, coming from a science policy studies background, more emphasis on how the alternatives technologies are formed, how alternative knowledges are sort of assessed and validated, and around that two issues, if one can do a review of the many discourses on local development around the world, I mean, I still don't think that we'll be able to really convince the policymakers, but at least a new kind of a narrative can be built. So thank you very much. But that's what I thought I should share. Yeah. But it was a very enriching discussion and very good work despite the breaks, etc. And I also thank both the examiners. I mean, you really raised some of the questions that I think should keep us all engaged with this topic. And the researchers. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sardindu, for your very insightful intervention in the discussion which took place here. And I do agree that entire course of human history has progressed through two forces. And the forces have applied on the survival issues. So there is always challenge to survival, and how the society has responded to that challenges that has shaped the society. I think this is an important intervention that you have made. So after hearing all these things, any other comments? Anyone? Okay, all right. So I think for our student, it is also a good learning experience that how Viva you have to face. So may I now request to our examiners, can we now recommend for award of PhD degree to Prem?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So on behalf of all the, I mean, sorry, external examiners, that thing, Professor Krishna, you
Yeah,
also?
of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So I congratulate Dr. Prem Mokhandi for completing his Viva successfully. So we recommend for award of his PhD degree. So many congratulations and welcome to academia. Yeah, fraternity of. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The recording has stopped.
We could